Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I'm glad to speak in support of the amendment to this bill moved by the member for Shortland, the Shadow Minister for International Development, and to follow some very fine contributions from the member of Perth and the member of Jagajaga in Sydney. Like my colleagues, I'm unashamedly a friend of Australian aid and a supporter of Australian aid, and it's welcome that we're taking the legislative action through this bill that's required to guarantee Australia's contribution to various multilateral aid funds, 6 of them. Australian aid is, without question, vital in the cause of saving lives and reducing poverty. Poverty that hurts people, poverty that causes suffering and preventable death, and regional instability and conflict, and all of the terrible things that can befall human communities. It is hard to think of a more important cause than Australian aid. So this guarantee is welcome, but it has to be seen in context, because under this government, Australian aid has been badly knocked about. AusAid was dissolved with significant impact on skills, personnel, knowledge, morale, and development assistance capacity. We know that $11.8 billion has been cut from the development assistance budget. It's the one area of government that has taken the largest impact of cuts from this government. For quite a long time, the government wasn't prepared to be open about where those cuts were falling. We know, thanks to the inquiries by the Shadow Minister for International Development in the Pacific, we know some of the detail of those cuts. So we know, for instance, that those cuts have resulted in a 41% decrease in education programs, a 32% decrease in aid programs focused on health outcomes, a 42% decrease in South Asia alone. So the funding guaranteed here is welcome, but it comes against a background of huge cuts and a huge retreat in the scope and capacity of our development assistance program. And it's a shame when you consider what well-targeted aid can achieve. The multilateral funds whose support is guaranteed through this bill includes the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Initiative. It's supported 36 underdeveloped nations. An analysis of this initiative has found that participation is, and I quote, associated with a 16% and a 12.5% reduction in child and infant mortality, respectively, and that those effects, those beneficial effects, are the largest in the poorest countries. But this government, since it was elected in 2013, has taken a wrecking ball to Australian aid. It's where the largest cuts that it has inflicted have fallen, and that's despite the kinds of supportive statements that the current Prime Minister made upon being elected. It's despite the interest that the former Foreign Minister, the former member for Curtin, had in aid. She's highly regarded and not without justification, but she was the Foreign Minister that presided over the dissolution of AusAid and the massive cuts to Australian aid. Development assistance has dropped to 0.19% of GNI. It was 0.37 in the last term of the former Labor government. It's dropped to 0.19% of GNI. That's the lowest in Australia's history. We've fallen from being a solid middle-of-the-pack OECD contributor to being one of the least generous. It's been a brutal hit in terms of the development assistance we provide to poor nations, including poor nations in our region. It means our influence on the economic development of countries in our regions has diminished, and our economic well-being will suffer as a result, because a lot of our programs are devoted to democratic capacity and other kinds of government systems that allow underdeveloped countries to develop and to become more economically capable. It means our influence on building peace and security in our region has been diminished. I mean, if you are serious about peace and security, if you're serious about keeping Australians safe, one of the things you do not do is cut Australian aid, because it is one of the best ways of building peace and regional security. So by not supporting better governance and democratic capacity, by not supporting better health and education, by not supporting better environmental and climate outcomes. We undermine the peace and security of our region and our own peace and security. Make no mistake about that. Taking the hammer to Australia's aid program, Deputy Speaker, also means that we save fewer lives. We save fewer lives and we lift fewer people out of aching poverty. We look at the awful decision made last year to stop assistance to Pakistan altogether after 70 years. An underdeveloped country that faces many challenges, with which we've had a strong partnership and an aid program partnership that's lasted 70 years, now cut away to nothing. In April last year, the Morrison government's aid budget summary said that gender disparities are stark in Pakistan and noted that 9 in 10 Pakistani women experience violence in their lifetime, among the world's highest rates of gender-based violence. The same summary noted that it was a key objective of Australia's aid to Pakistan to assist women and girls with a focus on education, access to reproductive health, and to combat gender-based violence. Pakistan is one of the poorest countries in Asia. It was placed 150 out of 178 nations on the most recent United Nations Human Development Index. So despite the circumstances of Pakistan, and despite only in April last year, less than 12 months ago, the Morrison government identifying the needs of Pakistan and the reasons why we should be supporting Pakistan, the decision was made late last year that we would stop supporting those kinds of development goals in Pakistan altogether. Deputy Speaker, I've listed the three consequences of our aid cuts: the fact that it undermines regional economic development, and it undermines regional peace and security, and it prevents us from reducing aching poverty and saving lives. And I've listed those consequences in what I consider to be the reverse priority. I think our aid program should proudly have saving the lives of desperate people and reducing the poverty that hundreds of millions of people face as our number one priority. It's absolutely a part of our character and values to lift up the lives of some of the most desperate and disadvantaged of our fellow human beings. But if you don't find that compelling, if you don't find that compelling enough, it's worth remembering that Australian aid, dollar for dollar, is one of the best kinds of government expenditure when it comes to economic capacity, and that ultimately means our own economic well-being through trade in our region as countries develop, and, as I've said before, building peace and security in our region. And that's why I'm an all-day and everyday supporter of Australian aid, and that's why that's the position of the Labor Party. It was in government, it has been and will be in opposition. I encourage people to consider and support Australian aid. I know the member for Perth talked about some of the misunderstandings about how big our aid program is, how much we contribute and what it achieves. I note that the campaign for Australian aid, which people might like to consider at australianaid.org, includes a whole number of reasons why we should support that program, and I'll just name a number of them. So in 2014 alone, Australian aid vaccinated more than 2.3 million children. It ensured nearly 1 million additional mothers had access to a skilled birth attendant. It provided critical services for more than 66,000 women who have survived violence. It supplied 2.9 million people with access to safe drinking water, and it responded to emergencies in 24 countries, including the Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines and flooding in the Solomon Islands. That's what Australian aid does. It's absolutely part of our character and our values as a nation, and it should be supported. I know that the government is going through the process of reconsidering, redesigning the aid program. I guess I have to observe it's hard to imagine how they could make it worse. If you no, well, I know I shouldn't be too optimistic. I should be cautious, and we should watch carefully. But when you start by dissolving Australia's standalone aid agency, and you follow by making Australian aid the victim of the largest budget cuts as a sort of category of government expense. And when you take Australian aid to the lowest level it has been in our history, and when you talk about how you're going to focus aid in our region, but actually aid to South Asia declines by 42%. When you talk about how you're going to be more Jakarta than Geneva, but you cut 50% of all aid to Indonesia, which means 86% of programs that deliver health assistance in Indonesia and 57% of programs that deliver education in Indonesia. And you come in and you spend a lot of time, you fashion your sort of aid-related 3-word slogan or 4-word slogan, more Jakarta, less Geneva, and then you go and do that to our nearest and one of our most significant neighbours in the region, 50% in aid funding. We welcome the President of Indonesia here. Last week we talk about how trade agreements are important. We talk about how the sort of the strategic position of comfort that Australia has enjoyed in our region for a period of time is changing, that it's much more challenging, that it's a sort of a geopolitical contest in which we need to be involved. And yet one of the means by which we are involved in our region, we are involved in that process, our Australian aid program has been ripped into 100 pieces and thrown on the floor. So anything has got to be better than what we've got, I say, cautiously. And you could only hope that this process of looking at our aid program going forward will do a number of things. It will certainly ensure that there are more resources, that the cuts stop, that the retreat from supporting our regional neighbours stops, that we look at what we've done in relation to Pakistan, reconsider that. Any and all of those things should occur. I do note the comments of the CEO of the Australian Council for International Development, which is the peak body for Australian NGOs in the international development space, Mark Purcell, and in relation to this aid review, he has said, and I quote, "For 70 years, Australia has assisted countries to create a more stable, peaceful and prosperous world through international aid and development. But we must always be vigilant about how the international environment is changing and tailor our foreign policy accordingly. A new development cooperation policy provides an opportunity to consider that environment and shape our response accordingly so it can best tackle poverty, injustice and inequality. The case for relevant Australian development assistance is compelling. Pacific Island nations are facing an existential crisis created by climate change. In Bangladesh, more than 1 million Rohingya people have fled persecution from Myanmar, and in Southeast Asia, over 300 million people live in extreme poverty and inequality is rising. Australia's response should be to rise to these challenges and for the best of Australian expertise and experience to be harnessed to work with our neighbours. Here. I entirely endorse that, and I can only hope that the government and the responsible minister is listening to what the sector has been saying for a long time. Deputy Speaker, let me finish by paying tribute to all those who work in the aid sector, both within Australian aid and in the non-government organisations that are our delivery partners. I was fortunate to be with a number of colleagues as part of a regional leadership initiative that visited Bangladesh in January, that saw the work that's being done to combat one of the greatest humanitarian crises afoot in the world, where you have nearly 1 million Rohingya people from Myanmar who have been forcibly pushed off their land and subject to terrible violence and are being looked after in Bangladesh with the support of international NGOs, including NGOs that rely on Australian government support. Also, programs in Dhaka, in the capital of Bangladesh, because Bangladesh itself is a country that has very significant development challenges. It has some 10 million people who are classed as ultra-poor, which means they survive on considerably less than $1.50 US a day and generally struggle to have more than 2 meals. So To all people involved in aid, we know you take on work that can be physically and emotionally draining. What you do is vital. What you do is some of the most compassionate and life-changing work that human beings can undertake. It matters so much. Thank you. Keep going.
Thank the member for